The Krathian Empire had conquered 73 star systems in less than a decade, and their armada, known as the Iron Talon Fleet, had never tasted defeat. And now, they sat in orbit around Earth, with their weapons trained on every major city across the planet, and the sky above every continent glowed with the ominous red light of alien warships, waiting to unleash destruction. Ambassador Daniel Price stood in the United Nations Assembly Hall, watching the holographic projection of High Commander Zekthor, and the alien's 4 eyes gleamed with satisfaction as his mandibles clicked together in what humanity had learned was the Krathian equivalent of a smile, and his massive form filled the projection space, making every human in the room feel small and insignificant. "Your military forces are destroyed," Zekthor announced, and his voice came through the communication array with a harsh metallic edge that made people wince. "And your orbital defenses are rubble, and your moon base is ashes, and your fleet is scattered debris floating in the void, and humanity will surrender unconditionally, or we will begin bombarding your cities, and you have 6 Earth hours to comply with our demands, or millions will die." The hologram flickered off, leaving the assembly in stunned silence, and President Helen Martinez sat with her head in her hands, and her shoulders shook with the weight of impossible decisions, and General Kyle Bennett, representing what remained of Earth's military command, looked hollow-eyed and defeated, and his uniform still bore scorch marks from the Battle of Luna Station, where he had barely escaped with his life. Every person in that room knew the reality of their situation, and Earth's defenses had crumbled in 3 weeks of brutal warfare, and the Krathians had destroyed the orbital platforms first, and then systematically demolished every military installation on the Moon and Mars, and the asteroid belt, and humanity's proud space navy now consisted of scattered survivors hiding in the outer system, and praying the Krathians wouldn't bother hunting them down. But Daniel Price remained calm, and he straightened his tie and cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the despair like a knife, and everyone turned to look at him with expressions that mixed hope and confusion, because what could a diplomat possibly do when the generals had failed? "Madam President," he said quietly, "and I need to speak with the Krathian commander immediately, and I need our legal team to pull up the Galactic Concordat, and specifically, Section 7 and Article 12, and I need every document related to the treaty that established the Concordat 47 years ago." Helen looked up with confusion written across her face. "And Daniel, we just lost the war," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "And what good will legal documents do now? And how can words stop those ships from turning our cities to ash, and our people to shadows burned into concrete?" "Everything, ma'am," Daniel replied, and a slight smile crossed his face, "for the first time in weeks, and everything depends on those documents, and the Krathians made a mistake, and they think they've won, but they forgot something important, and something that might just save us all if I'm right." The room erupted in confused murmurs, and General Bennett stood up with anger flashing in his eyes. "And Ambassador Price, we don't have time for legal games," he said, "and we have 6 hours before they start killing civilians, and we need to evacuate the cities, and prepare emergency shelters, and make peace with the fact that we've lost." "No," Daniel said firmly, "and we haven't lost, and not yet, and not if the Krathians signed the documents I think they signed, and not if they agreed to the terms I remember reading about in my first year studying galactic law." And he turned to his assistant Greg Foster, who stood nearby with a tablet, "And Greg, find me everything about the challenge clause." Greg's fingers flew across his tablet, and his eyes widened as he read. "And Daniel, you're thinking about invoking a truth trial?" he asked, and his voice rose with excitement. "And nobody's done that in the entire history of the 5 Concordat, and it's considered a ceremonial relic, and most species don't even know it exists." "Exactly," Daniel said, "and which means the Krathians probably forgot about it too, and they're so confident in their military superiority that they never considered we might have another option." And Lisa Morgan stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the wall, and she was Earth's chief legal advisor, and her mind was already racing through the implications. "If we invoke the challenge clause," Lisa said slowly, "and all military action has to cease immediately, and both sides present their case before a neutral tribunal, and the aggressor has to prove they followed all Concordat principles, and if they can't prove it, they have to withdraw completely and pay reparations. And her eyes met Daniel's. And you think the Krathians violated Concordat principles? I know they did, Daniel said, and I watched the battle footage and I saw the weapons they used, and some of those weapons were banned 15 years ago, and the Krathians signed that ban themselves, and they used prohibited technology because they knew they couldn't beat us in a fair fight, and now we're going to make them pay for that arrogance. President Martinez stood up, and her despair was transforming into something else, and something that looked almost like hope. And how do we invoke this clause? She asked. And what do we need to do? And how much time do we have? I need to contact High Commander Zekthor within the hour, Daniel said. And I need the legal team to prepare all the documentation. And I need military analysts to review every second of combat footage and look for Concordat violations. And I need xenoanthropologists to brief me on Krathian culture and honor codes, because we're not just going to beat them legally, and we're going to humiliate them. The assembly hall transformed from a place of mourning to a command center, and people rushed to their tasks, and Lisa gathered her legal team, and Greg contacted every expert on galactic law he could find, and General Bennett, despite his skepticism, ordered his intelligence officers to compile every piece of combat data they had. Daniel stood at the center of the storm with his mind already planning the conversation he would have with Zekthor and the Krathians, had given humanity 6 hours. But Daniel would need only one, and he would use that hour to do something no species had ever done before. And he would invoke a rule so old that most of the galaxy had forgotten it existed. Betty Clark arrived within 30 minutes, and she was a war crimes investigator pulled from retirement, and her expertise would be crucial in identifying exactly which Concordat principles the Krathians had violated, and she immediately began reviewing footage from the Battle of Mars Station, and her trained eye caught details that others had missed. The Krathians are using Helix-class interceptors, she said, and pointed at the screen, and those were banned because their weapons can't distinguish between military and civilian targets. And here in the Battle of Titan, and they deployed shriek mines and those target life signs indiscriminately. And both are classified as prohibited weapons under the Concordat. Daniel felt his confidence growing, and document everything he ordered, and I want timestamps and weapon signatures and serial numbers if you can get them. And I want this case to be so airtight that the Krathians can't wiggle out of it. With technicalities, and when I present this to Zekthor, I want him to know that we've caught him red-handed. 50 minutes after Zekthor's ultimatum, Daniel stood in the communication chamber, and his team flanked him, carrying tablets loaded with preliminary evidence, and the communication array activated, and the Krathian commander's image appeared, and his 4 eyes radiated contempt. Have you come to surrender, human? Zekthor asked, and his mandibles clicked with amusement. And will you beg for mercy for your cities, or will you watch them burn and know that your pride killed millions? Neither, Daniel said calmly, and I've come to inform you that humanity invokes the challenge clause under Section 7 and Article 12 of the Galactic Concordat, and we demand a truth trial before a neutral tribunal, and all military action must cease immediately until the tribunal renders its verdict. The change in Zekthor's expression was immediate, and his 4 eyes widened, and his mandibles froze mid-click, and for several long seconds he simply stared at Daniel, and the silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. High Commander Zekthor stared at the human diplomat through the holographic display, and his 4 eyes showed something that Daniel had never seen before, and it looked almost like uncertainty, and the mighty Krathian commander, who had destroyed countless civilizations, was suddenly faced with something his weapons couldn't solve. That clause has never been invoked, Zekthor finally said, and his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. And it is a ceremonial relic from the founding species, and it has no practical application in modern warfare, and you are wasting my time with ancient, irrelevant protocols. Daniel smiled and pulled up a document on his tablet, and according to Concordat law, the challenge clause remains fully active and binding on all member species, regardless of how long it has been since last use and your empire signed the Concordat 47 years ago, and that signature makes you bound by every article and every clause, including this one. Lisa Morgan stepped forward, and her legal expertise evident in every word, and the clause is quite clear. Commander, and any species facing extinction-level military action, may demand a truth trial, and during the trial period, all Military action must cease, and both sides present their case before a neutral tribunal. And if the defending species can prove the aggressor violated any concordat principle, the aggressor must withdraw completely and pay reparations. This is absurd. Zekthor roared, and his mandibles spread wide in a gesture of rage. And you cannot lawyer your way out of military defeat. And you lost this war. And your fleets are destroyed, and your defenses are broken. And no amount of legal manipulation will change those facts. Greg Foster spoke up, and his research into Krathian culture, giving him confidence, and in Krathian society, honor and strength are inseparable, are they not? Commander and a warrior who wins through dishonorable means is considered worse than a warrior who loses with honor, and the Concordat represents the galaxy's agreement on what constitutes honorable warfare. Zekthor's eyes blazed with fury, and do not presume to lecture me on Krathian honor human, he spat, and we have conducted this war with perfect honor, and we destroyed your military forces in open combat, and we gave you opportunities to surrender, and we followed every protocol. Then you have nothing to fear from a truth trial, Daniel said smoothly, and if your conduct was honorable, and if you followed all Concordat principles, then the tribunal will rule in your favor, and you can proceed with our surrender, but if you refuse the trial, then every species in the galaxy will question why the mighty Krathian Empire fears a simple legal proceeding. The trap was perfect, and Zekthor knew it, and if he refused the truth trial, he would appear weak and dishonorable, and other Concordat species would wonder what the Krathians were hiding, but if he accepted, he would be forced to halt his military campaign and submit to scrutiny, and either option was unacceptable, but he had to choose. Very well, Zekthor said finally, and his voice tight with controlled rage, and we accept your challenge, and the tribunal will convene, and we will prove our honor, and then we will complete your conquest, and I promise you, human, that when this farce is over, your species will regret wasting our time. The communication ended and the hologram disappeared, and Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and Lisa grabbed his arm with excitement in her eyes. And we did it, she said. And we actually got them to accept, and now we have time to build our case. Time is exactly what we bought, Daniel agreed, but now comes the hard part, and we need to prove that the Krathians violated Concordat principles, and we need evidence that's absolutely irrefutable, and we have 72 hours before the tribunal convenes. President Martinez entered the communication chamber, and her expression showing cautious hope. And, Daniel, you just did the impossible, she said. But can we actually win this truth trial? And do we have enough evidence to prove the Krathians broke the rules? We're going to find out, Daniel said, and he turned to his assembled team. And Greg, I need everything you can find on Concordat, weapons treaties, and Lisa, start preparing our legal arguments, and Betty, keep analyzing that combat footage. And General Bennett, I need your best tactical analysts, and everyone works around the clock until we have our case. The next 72 hours became a blur of activity, and the team worked in shifts, analyzing every scrap of data from the war, and Betty discovered that the Krathians had used at least 4 different types of prohibited weapons, and the Krutuvtine Helix-class interceptors were just the beginning. Look at this footage from the Battle of Europa, Betty said, and pointed at her screen, and the Krathians deployed neural disruptors, and those weapons cause massive pain to any organic being within range, and they were banned 30 years ago, because they constitute torture devices rather than legitimate military weapons. Lisa added that to the growing list of violations, and her legal brief was becoming more damning by the hour, and the Krathians had also attacked clearly marked medical vessels, and destroyed civilian evacuation ships, and targeted refugee stations that had no military value whatsoever. But Daniel knew that evidence alone wouldn't guarantee victory, and the Krathians were master politicians, and they would have explanations for everything, and they would claim military necessity, and argue technicalities, and confuse the tribunal with complex justifications. Greg, we need to understand Krathian psychology, Daniel said, and what matters most to them culturally, and what would hurt them more than just losing the trial. Greg had been studying Krathian history and culture non-stop. And honor through strength is their entire identity, he explained. And they believe that military superiority proves moral superiority, and that the strong have the right to rule the weak, and their entire social structure is based on this principle. So if we prove they won through cheating rather than strength, Daniel said slowly, and we don't just prove they violated the rules, and we prove they're weak, and that they couldn't beat us in a fair fight. Exactly, Greg said, and his eyes lighting up, and in Krathian culture, that would be the ultimate humiliation, and a dishonorable victory is worse than an honorable defeat, and if we can prove they only won because they used prohibited weapons, and we destroy their claim to superior strength. The team worked through the night, building their case, and Lisa crafted legal arguments that were impossible to refute, and Betty compiled video evidence with timestamps and weapon signatures, and Greg prepared cultural analysis that would frame the Krathians' actions in the worst possible light. Daniel reviewed everything, and made notes, and refined their strategy, and they would present 3 main arguments, and first, that the Krathians used prohibited weapons, and second, that they deliberately targeted civilians, and third, that they did all this because they were losing the fair fight. The third point was crucial, and Daniel had military analysts review the tactical situation before the Krathians deployed prohibited weapons, and the analysis showed something remarkable, and humanity had been holding its own, and even pushing back in several sectors. This is perfect, Daniel said, and studying the tactical maps, and the war was a stalemate until the Krathians started cheating, and that proves they couldn't win through superior strength alone, and that destroys their entire claim to honor. President Martinez visited the command center on the second day, and she brought food and coffee and words of encouragement, and the whole world is watching, she said, and billions of people are praying for your success, and you're carrying the hopes of our entire species. No pressure, Daniel joked, but his smile was genuine, and we're going to win this, Madam President. And the Krathians made a mistake, and they assumed we'd just roll over and die, but humanity doesn't work that way. On the third day, the team assembled their final presentation, and Lisa had prepared a legal brief that cited 17 different Concordat violations, and Betty had video evidence of each violation with expert analysis, and Greg had cultural context that would make the tribunal understand the full scope of Krathian dishonor. Daniel reviewed the presentation one last time, and his team exhausted but determined. And this is good, he said, and this is really good. But remember that the tribunal judges come from different species with different values, and we need to make them care about human survival, and make them see us as worth saving. We emphasize that we invoked a forgotten rule, Lisa suggested, and that shows resourcefulness and determination, and qualities that any species would respect, and we show that we're not just victims, but survivors who refuse to give up. The transport ship arrived to take them to Harmony's Reach, and the neutral Concordat station where the tribunal would convene, and Daniel and his core team boarded, and Lisa, and Greg, and Betty, and each carrying tablets loaded with evidence and arguments. As Earth fell away behind them, Daniel looked out the viewport at his home planet, and Krathian ships still surrounded it, and their weapons still aimed at defenseless cities, but now, those weapons were silent and bound by the very laws. The Krathians had agreed to follow. You really think we can pull this off? Lisa asked quietly, and her confidence wavering for just a moment. Daniel turned from the viewport and met her eyes. And we have to, he said simply, and because if we don't, then humanity dies. And I'm not ready to let that happen. And not when we have truth and law on our side. And not when the Mother Nain. Krathians handed us the perfect case by being arrogant enough to think nobody would notice their cheating. Harmony's Reach was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen, and the massive station floated in the void between star systems, and its architecture blended designs from dozens of different species, and crystalline spires rose alongside, organic structures, and metallic platforms, and creating something that was both beautiful and alien. The human delegation arrived 12 hours before the tribunal was scheduled to convene, and they were escorted to quarters in the neutral zone, and the station's protocols ensured that both humans and Krathians would have no contact before the official proceedings, and preventing any possibility of intimidation or interference. Daniel used those 12 hours to rehearse their presentation, and Lisa went through her legal arguments again and again, and Greg reviewed his cultural analysis, and Betty made sure every piece of video evidence was properly time-stamped, verified, and the team functioned like a well-oiled machine, despite their exhaustion. The Krathians arrived in force, and their delegation included not just High Commander Zekthor, but also legal advisors and military historians and cultural experts, and they came prepared to defend their actions, and clearly confident that they would crush the human challenge as easily as they had crushed human fleets. Daniel watched through the viewport as the Krathian ship docked, and it was a massive vessel bristling with weapons, and its very presence a statement of power and intimidation. And Zekthor emerged surrounded by guards in ceremonial armor and their 4 eyes scanning the station with contempt. "They think this is already over," Lisa said quietly and standing beside Daniel, "and they think we're just delaying the inevitable." "Good," Daniel replied, "and let them be overconfident. And overconfidence leads to mistakes, and mistakes are what we're counting on." The tribunal chamber was a vast circular room with 7 elevated seats for the judges, and each judge represented a different member species of the Concordat, and their job was to ensure that the laws that governed galactic civilization were upheld fairly and without bias. Elder Sorvas of the Melnari took the central seat, and her species was one of the Concordat's founders, and her 3 eyes regarded both delegations with ancient wisdom, and she had presided over dozens of disputes in her long life, but never a truth trial, and those were legendary but had never actually occurred in living memory. The other judges included a Vexian whose crystalline body pulsed with soft light, and a Horthak whose aquatic form floated in a specialized tank, and a Zen whose insectoid features clicked and chittered as they communicated through translation devices, and 4 others representing the diverse species that made up the galactic community. "This tribunal has been convened under the Challenge Clause," Elder Sorvas began, and her voice was translated into every language simultaneously, and Section 7 and Article 12 of the Galactic Concordat and the human species has accused the Krathian Empire of conducting their military campaign in violation of Concordat principles, and High Commander Zekthor, how do you respond? "The accusation is baseless," Zekthor declared, and rose to his full impressive height. "And the Krathian Empire has conducted this war with honor and in full accordance with Concordat law. And we have followed every protocol and every regulation, and the humans are desperate and grasping at legal technicalities because they cannot match us in battle, and they seek to use words as weapons because their actual weapons failed." Ambassador Price Elder Sorvas continued, and turning to Daniel, "And please present your opening statement." Daniel stood, and his voice calm and measured. "And honorable tribunal, we will prove 3 things today. And first, that the Krathian Empire used prohibited weapons in direct violation of multiple treaty agreements, and second, that they deliberately targeted civilian populations in violation of the rules of engagement, and third, that they did so because they knew they could not defeat humanity in a fair military engagement." The chamber erupted with Zekthor's roar of rage and lies. He bellowed, and his mandibles spread wide, "And we have defeated you completely, and your fleets are destroyed, and your defenses are rubble. And how dare you claim we needed to cheat when we have proven our absolute superiority? Please control yourself." "Commander," Elder Sorvas warned, and her voice sharp, "and you will have your opportunity to respond. But you must allow the human delegation to present their evidence. And another outburst will result in sanctions." Zekthor settled back, but his 4 eyes blazed with fury, and Daniel continued, "And we understand that war is brutal, and we understand that the Krathian military is formidable, but there are rules that all civilized species agree to follow, and rules that separate honorable warfare from mere butchery, and the Krathians violated those rules repeatedly and systematically." Lisa stepped forward with her first presentation, "And may I direct the tribunal's attention to Exhibit A," she said, and activated a holographic display. "And this is footage from the Battle of Mars Station and 17 days ago. And please, note the vessels approaching the human defensive positions." The hologram showed Krathian fighters swarming toward Mars Station, and their weapons blazing, and Lisa zoomed in on specific fighters. "And these are Helix-class interceptors," she explained, "and they were banned by the Concordat 15. years ago, and the ban was signed by every member species, including the Krathian Empire. And the reason for the ban was simple. And these weapons cannot distinguish between military and civilian targets. She pulled up the treaty document, and here is the Weapons Prohibition Treaty of 15 years ago, and signed by then Fleet Commander Zekthor and now High Commander, and the language is explicit, and Helix-class interceptors are forbidden in any military engagement, and yet the Krathians deployed at least 40 of them at Mars Station alone. That is a misidentification, Zekthor interrupted, and those were modified Galix-class interceptors, which are perfectly legal, and your analysts are mistaken. Betty Clark stepped forward, and I am a certified weapons analyst with 30 years of experience, she said, and I have examined the footage at the molecular signature level, and these are definitely Helix-class interceptors, and the 4 energy signature is distinct and unmistakable. And here is the comparative analysis. She displayed detailed technical readouts that showed the exact match between the weapons used at Mars Station and the banned Helix-class systems, and the evidence was irrefutable, and the tribunal judges leaned forward studying the seed data, and several made notes. Furthermore, Betty continued, and the Krathians deployed shriek mines at the Battle of Titan, and these devices target life signs indiscriminately, and they were banned 30 years ago and classified as torture devices rather than legitimate military weapons, and here is footage of their deployment. The hologram showed small drones being released from a Krathian capital ship, and they spread out across the battlefield, and then began emitting waves of energy that caused visible pain to anyone nearby, and human soldiers collapsed. Screaming, and even Krathian soldiers caught in the blast radius showed distress. The shriek mines were necessary to break a fortified position. Zekthor argued. And military necessity sometimes requires harsh measures. Military necessity does not override concordant law, Elder Sorvas said firmly, and that is the entire point of having such laws. And please continue, Ambassador Price. For the next 3 hours, Daniel's team systematically presented evidence of concordant violations, and they showed attacks on clearly marked medical vessels and destruction of civilian evacuation ships and targeting of refugee stations that had no military value, and each violation was documented with video evidence and expert testimony and legal citations. Lisa handled the technical legal arguments and citing treaty after treaty that the Krathians had violated, and her presentation was meticulous and thorough, and she anticipated every possible counter-argument and had evidence ready to refute it. Betty presented combat analysis that showed the Krathians had consistently chosen prohibited tactics over legal alternatives, and in each case, the prohibited weapons or tactics had been more brutal and more indiscriminate and more likely to cause civilian casualties. But it was Greg who delivered the devastating blow that Daniel had been building toward, and the Krathians claim they defeated humanity through superior strength, he said, and activating a series of tactical maps, but the truth is very different, and before the Krathians deployed prohibited weapons, the war was a stalemate. He showed comparative analyses of the first week of fighting, and human forces were holding their defensive positions, he explained. And in several sectors, we were actually pushing back. And at the Battle of Callisto, human fighters achieved a 3-to-1 kill ratio against Krathian interceptors, and at the defense of Europa Station, human tactics forced a Krathian retreat. The tactical maps clearly showed the turning point and the moment when Krathian victories became inevitable, and it coincided exactly with the deployment of banned technology, and the Helix interceptors appeared first, and then the shriek mines, and then neural disruptors, and with each new prohibited weapon, the balance of power shifted. The Krathians didn't win through strength, Greg concluded, and his voice ringing with conviction. And they won through cheating. And when the fight was fair, they were losing. And when human courage and tactics proved equal to Krathian might, they broke the rules, and in their own culture that makes them something worse than defeated, and it makes them without honor. The chamber fell silent, and the weight of that accusation hung in the air, and for Krathians honor and strength were inseparable, and to be accused of winning dishonorably was the deepest possible insult. Zekthor stood trembling with rage, and you dare, he whispered, and his voice dangerous, and you dare question Krathian honor, and we are the greatest military power this galaxy has ever seen. Then why did you need to cheat? Daniel asked quietly, And if you're so superior, why couldn't you beat us fairly? And why did you deploy weapons you had agreed were too dishonorable to use? And the answer is simple. Commander, and you were afraid, and afraid that humanity might actually win, and afraid that your reputation for invincibility might be shattered, and so you broke your word, and violated your treaties, and sacrificed your honor, because winning mattered more than how you won. The silence in the tribunal chamber was absolute, and Zekthor's 4 eyes fixed on Daniel with pure hatred, and his mandibles trembled, and every Krathian in the delegation looked ready to attack. And only the presence of the tribunal judges and the sanctity of concordate law prevented violence. Elder Sorvas raised one crystalline hand, and Commander Zekthor, you will have the opportunity to present your defense, she said. And her voice calm, but firm. And Ambassador Price, your opening presentation is complete, and the Prost tribunal will now hear the Krathian response. Zekthor took several moments to compose himself, and when he finally spoke, his voice was controlled. But the rage beneath was obvious, and the human accusations are based on misunderstandings and incomplete data. He began. And yes, we deployed advanced weapons systems, but all were within the bounds of military necessity, and the treaties they cite have exceptions for legitimate warfare. He gestured to his legal advisor, who stepped forward, and a Krathian named Velkoth, whose expertise in concordat law was supposedly unmatched, and the Weapons Prohibition Treaty contains Clause 9, which states that in cases of existential military conflict, certain restrictions may be temporarily suspended, and our war with humanity qualified as such a conflict. Lisa was ready and stood immediately, and Clause 9 requires advance notification to the Concordat Council and formal documentation of the existential threat. And she pulled up records, and the Krathians filed no such notification, and they provided no documentation, and they cannot retroactively claim an exception they never invoked. Velkoth's mandibles clicked in frustration, and the speed of the conflict made formal notification impossible, he argued, and we acted in good faith, under emergency conditions. The treaty explicitly addresses emergency conditions, Lisa countered, and it requires notification within 72 hours of deployment. And the Battle of Mars Station occurred 17 days ago, and the Krathians have had ample time to file the proper documentation, and they have not done so because they know their actions don't qualify for the exemption. The judges conferred quietly, and Elder Sorvas made notes, and the Vexian judge, whose name was Luminara, pulsed with questioning light, and asked if the Krathians could provide any evidence that they had attempted to follow proper protocols. Zekthor had no answer, and his legal team shuffled documents and whispered urgently, but they had nothing, and they had assumed the war would be over so quickly that legal niceties wouldn't matter. And they had never expected to be challenged. Furthermore, Betty Clark added, and rising to present more evidence, and the Krathians attacked medical vessels that were clearly marked with Concordat medical insignia. And there is no military necessity exception for such attacks, and they are absolutely prohibited under any circumstances. She displayed footage of a human hospital ship and its hull covered in the Universal Red Cross markings that identified medical vessels, and a Krathian cruiser approached, and without warning opened fire, and the hospital ship exploded, killing 300 medical personnel and 2,000 wounded soldiers who were receiving treatment. That vessel was providing support to enemy military forces, Zekthor argued, and it was a legitimate military target. The rules of engagement are explicit, Elder Sorvas said, and her voice hard, and medical vessels are protected unless they are actively engaged in combat operations, and providing medical care to wounded soldiers does not constitute excidents, combat operations, and this attack was a clear violation. The tribunal judges seemed increasingly disturbed, and the Horthak judge, whose name was Wave Dancer, made bubbling sounds that translated as deep concern, and these violations suggest a pattern rather than isolated incidents. The judge, R said, and that raises questions about Krathian adherence to concordat principles more broadly. Daniel saw his opening and honorable tribunal, he said, and we believe the pattern is clear, and the Krathians did not stumble into these violations accidentally, and they made deliberate choices to use prohibited weapons and attack protected targets and ignore established rules, and why, and because they were losing the fair fight. Lies, Zekthor roared, and we were dominating the humans at every engagement. Then, explain this, Greg said, and activated a new tactical display. And this shows the strategic situation. After 1 week of fighting and human defensive lines held here and here and here, and Crothian advances were stalled at Europa, and Callisto and Ganymede, and your casualty rates were climbing, and your supply lines were stretched, and you were facing the possibility of a protracted war that you might not win. The display showed detailed analysis, and the data came from Crothian military transmissions that human intelligence had intercepted, and the transmissions showed Crothian commanders expressing concern and requesting reinforcements and requesting reinforcements, reporting higher than expected losses. On day 8 of the war, Greg continued, and High Commander Zekthor sent a message to the Crothian High Council. And the message stated, and I quote, "And human resistance is unexpectedly fierce, and conventional tactics are proving insufficient, and request authorization for expanded weapons deployment." The tribunal chamber erupted in murmurs, and Zekthor's 4 eyes widened because that transmission was supposed to be classified, and how did the humans obtain it? "We have our sources," Daniel said calmly, "and the important point is that it proves our argument." And the Crothians requested expanded weapons deployment because they couldn't win with legal weapons, and the very next day, Helix. Interceptors appeared in battle for the first time. "The timeline is damning," Greg added. And day 8, the request for expanded weapons, and day 9, the first use of Helix interceptors, and day 12, the deployment of Shriek mines, and day 14, the attack on the hospital ship, and day 16, the use of neural disruptors. And each escalation occurred because the previous level of force wasn't achieving quick enough victory. Lisa presented the final piece of evidence, and the Concordat defines honorable warfare as conflict conducted with respect for established laws and with regard for civilian life, and with weapons that cause only necessary military damage. The Crothians violated all 3 principles, and they ignored established laws, and they disregarded civilian life, and they used weapons designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve military objectives. The tribunal judges conferred for several minutes, and their expressions grave, and Elder Sorvas finally spoke, and Commander Thor, "The evidence presented is substantial and troubling. And do you have any defense beyond claiming military necessity?" Thor stood, and his massive form seeming diminished somehow. "And we are warriors," he said, and his voice quieter now. "And we fight to win, and the strong should rule the weak, and that is the natural order. And humanity challenged our strength, and we responded with superior force, and that is what warriors do." "But you didn't use superior force," Daniel said, and standing to face him directly, "and you used illegal force. And there's a difference, and the Concordat exists precisely to make sure that strength doesn't mean the freedom to commit atrocities, and you agreed to those limits when you joined, and now you want to ignore them because following the rules meant you might lose." "We would never lose to humans," Zekthor snarled, and his pride overwhelming his caution. "Then why did you cheat?" Daniel asked. And the question, hanging in the air, "And why did you deploy weapons you knew were prohibited? And why did you attack medical vessels? And why did you violate every principle of honorable warfare? And if you were truly superior, you wouldn't have needed to do any of that." The chamber fell silent again, and the truth of Daniel's words was undeniable, and the Crothians had cheated, and the evidence proved it, and no amount of bluster or claims of military necessity could erase that fact. Elder Sorvas looked at her fellow judges, and they nodded in agreement. "And the tribunal will adjourn to deliberate," she announced, "and both delegations will return to their quarters, and we will render our verdict within 6 hours. This session is concluded." As the chamber emptied, Daniel felt exhaustion wash over him, and they had done everything they could, and presented every piece of evidence, and made every argument, and now it was in the hands of the tribunal. Lisa grabbed his arm. "And we did it," she whispered, "and we actually presented a winning case, and I've never seen such clear evidence of Concordat violations, and they have to rule in our favor." "Don't celebrate yet," Daniel warned, "but yes, I think we made our case, and now we wait and see if justice actually means anything in this galaxy." The human delegation returned to their quarters, and the 6 hours of waiting felt like 6 years, and Daniel tried to rest, but his mind kept replaying the trial and wondering if they had missed anything, and hoping that the judges would see the truth as clearly as he did. Zekthor and his delegation waited in their own quarters, and the Crothian commander paced like a caged predator, and he knew the trial had not gone well, and his legal advisors offered reassurances, but their voices lacked conviction, and the evidence against them was simply too strong. In the tribunal chamber, the 7 judges reviewed every piece of evidence, and debated every legal point, and considered the implications of their decision. And Elder Sorvas guided the discussion with wisdom earned over centuries, and the other judges contributed their perspectives and their unique cultural understandings. The Vexian judge Luminara pointed out that allowing the Krathian violations to stand would undermine the entire Concordat, and if powerful species could ignore the rules whenever convenient, then the laws meant nothing. And Wave Dancer agreed, and added that protecting civilian populations was fundamental to galactic civilization. The Zen judge, whose name was Hivemind, expressed concern about setting precedent but ultimately agreed that the evidence was too clear to ignore, and the other judges nodded in agreement, and one by one they reached consensus. After 6 hours that felt eternal, the summons came, and both delegations were called back to the tribunal chamber, and Daniel walked with his team, and his heart pounding, and everything humanity had fought for, and everything they hoped to preserve came down to the next few minutes. The tribunal judges took their seats, and Elder Sorvas looked out at the assembled delegations, and her expression was grave but determined. And Daniel felt hope surging in his chest, because that expression suggested justice was about to be served. This tribunal has reviewed all evidence and arguments presented by both parties, Elder Sorvas began, and her voice carrying the weight of authority, and the accusations made by humanity are severe, and if proven would represent a fundamental betrayal of the Concordat principles that maintain peace across our galaxy, and we have considered everything carefully and with full awareness of the implications of our decision. Daniel stood with his team, and his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling, and beside him Lisa held her breath, and Greg's eyes were fixed on the judges, and Betty stood rigid with tension, and everything they had worked for came down to this moment. Zekthor stood with his delegation, and his 4 eyes blazing with defiance. But Daniel could see uncertainty there too. And the mighty Krathian commander who had conquered 73 star systems was facing something he couldn't defeat with weapons, and the law was speaking, and he had to listen. After careful consideration, Elder Sorvas continued, and we find that the evidence presented by humanity is conclusive and irrefutable. And the Krathian Empire did employ prohibited weapon systems in direct violation of multiple treaty agreements, and they did target civilian populations in a manner inconsistent with the rules of engagement, and they did so deliberately and with full knowledge of these violations. The chamber erupted with sound, and the Krathian delegation shouted protests, and human observers, who had been watching via holographic feed across Earth, began celebrating, and Elder Sorvas raised her hand for silence, and the noise gradually subsided. Furthermore, the elder judge said, and her voice hardening, and we find that these violations were not isolated incidents or mistakes of war, but rather a systematic campaign designed to circumvent the very laws the Krathian Empire swore to uphold, and the timeline clearly shows escalating violations that corresponded with military setbacks, and this demonstrates conscious choice rather than unfortunate accident. This is outrageous, Zekthor bellowed, and rising to his full height, and we are the strongest military power in this galaxy, and you cannot dictate terms to us, and we will not accept this ruling, and we will not be bound by the decision of judges who do not understand the realities of warfare. The strength of your military is precisely why these laws exist, Commander Elder Sorvas replied, and her voice cold as ice, and the Concordat was not created to protect the strong, and it was created to ensure the strong do not abuse their power, and you claim strength, but you demonstrated weakness, and you claim honor. But you showed dishonor, and you claim superiority, but you proved only that you will cheat when faced with worthy opponents. The words struck Zekthor like physical blows, and in Krathian culture, such accusations were the deepest possible insult, and his mandibles spread wide, and his whole body trembled with rage, but he was trapped, and if he attacked now, would only prove the tribunal's point, and if he accepted the insult, he would lose face, and either way he had lost. The ruling of this tribunal is as follows, Elder Sorvas declared, and her voice formal and final, and the Krathian Empire must immediately withdraw all military forces from human space, and all occupied human territories must be returned to human control, and the Empire will pay reparations to humanity for damages caused by their illegal military action, and the amount will be determined by a separate arbitration council. Furthermore, she continued, and for a period of 20 standard years, the Krathian Empire will be barred from any military expansion beyond their current borders, and any violation of this restriction will result in immediate concordat sanctions, and the Empire will submit to regular inspections to verify compliance with all weapons, treaties, and any prohibited weapons currently in their arsenal must be destroyed within 6 months. The sentence was devastating, and the Krathians were not just defeated but humiliated, and their military expansion halted, and their honor questioned, and their claims of superiority shattered, and for 20 years, they would be watched and restricted and reminded of their dishonor. And if we refuse, Zekthor demanded, and his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Then you will be expelled from the Concordat, Elder Sorvas said simply, and every species in this tribunal will have the right to impose economic and military sanctions against your empire, and your trade routes will be closed, and your diplomatic missions will be expelled, and you will be isolated and marked as oathbreakers and treated as the galaxy's pariah until you comply. And the choice is yours, Commander. The weight of that statement settled over the chamber like a blanket, and the Krathian Empire was powerful, but not powerful enough to stand against the combined forces of the entire Concordat, and every species that valued law and order would turn against them, and their economy would collapse, and their empire would crumble, and Zekthor knew it. We will comply, Zekthor finally said, and the words seeming to tear from his throat. But this is not over-human, and you think you've won, but all you've done is make an eternal enemy, and someday, the Krathian Empire will return, and we will remember this humiliation. Daniel met his gaze without flinching, and no, Commander, he said quietly. And all we've done is remind you that power without honor is just tyranny. And tyranny eventually always falls. And you had the chance to defeat us fairly. And you chose to cheat instead, and now you pay the price. And if you want to blame someone for your humiliation, then blame yourself for forgetting that rules apply even to the strong. The tribunal session ended, and the judges filed out, and the Krathian delegation left in disgrace, and their heads held high, but their defeat obvious. And Daniel stood with his team, and the reality of what they had accomplished slowly sinking in. We did it, Lisa said, and her voice breaking with emotion, and we actually saved humanity, and we won. The celebrations began immediately, and across Earth billions of people poured into the streets and cities that had been hours away from bombardment now erupted with joy and relief. And humanity had faced extinction, and survived, and not through superior firepower, but through determination and intelligence, and the willingness to fight with every tool available. President Helen Martinez addressed the planet that evening, and standing before a crowd of millions in New York, and her voice carried to every corner of Earth, and every human colony and outpost. And today, we learned something important, she said, and we learned that humanity's greatest strength isn't our weapons or our ships, and it's our refusal to give up. And when the Krathians thought they'd won, and when they thought we had nothing left, we found a way. She paused and looked out at the celebrating crowds, and because that's what humans do, she continued, and we adapt, and we persist, and we never ever stop fighting, and the Krathians came here expecting an easy conquest, and they found a species that wouldn't break, and wouldn't surrender, and wouldn't accept defeat. And they learned what every bully eventually learns, and that strength without honor is weakness, and power without justice is tyranny. The crowd roared its approval, and Helen smiled. And to Ambassador Daniel Price and his team, she said, and you saved us all, and you proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is knowing the rules better than your enemy. And, to every human watching tonight, remember this moment, And remember that we survived because we were smarter and tougher and more determined than anyone expected. Back on Harmony's Reach, Daniel watched the speech with his exhausted team, and they had done the impossible and saved billions of lives and forever changed humanity's place in the galaxy. And the weight of that accomplishment was only beginning to register. So what now? Betty asked. And the Krathians aren't going to forget this, and they'll be back someday and probably angrier than before. Then we'll be ready, Daniel said, and because now the galaxy knows something they didn't know before, and they know that humanity doesn't just survive, and we find a way to win, even when all the odds say we shouldn't. And we do it by being smarter and more creative and more stubborn than anyone expects. Greg raised his coffee cup, and to Rule 712 he said, and may it never need to be invoked again. But if it does, Lisa added with a grin, and may we always be the ones who remember it first. They drank to that, and 3 humans who had used nothing but words and determination to defeat an empire. And the galaxy had expected humanity to fall. And instead, they had seen humanity rise, and not through violence, but through intelligence. And not through conquest, but through justice. Within a week, Krathian ships began departing Earth's orbit, and the massive warships that had threatened humanity's homeworld turned and jumped to hyperspace, and their weapons silent, and their crews defeated and humiliated. High Commander Zekthor was recalled to the Krathian homeworld, and stripped of his command, and his career destroyed by his failure. Human prisoners were returned, and reparations began flowing, and Earth's cities began rebuilding, and the scars of war would take years to heal. But humanity had survived, and emerged stronger and more united than before. The other Concordat species watched with interest, and humanity had been a minor player in galactic politics, and barely noticed, and now they were the species that had invoked an ancient law, and defeated a major empire, and used legal expertise to achieve what military might could not. Diplomatic overtures began arriving, and species that had ignored humanity now wanted trade agreements and cultural exchanges and military alliances, and Earth suddenly found itself with options and opportunities and influence that it had never possessed before. But Daniel knew the real victory was simpler, and humanity had proven something important, and not just to the galaxy but to themselves, and they had proven that they belonged, and that they could compete, and that they wouldn't be bullied, or conquered or erased, and they would fight with every tool available, and never surrender, and never give up. In Geneva, the team finally got some rest and their work complete and their species saved, and Daniel sat in his office and looked out at the city and thought about everything that had happened, and 3 weeks ago, Earth had been hours from annihilation, and now they were free and protected by the same laws that the Krathians had tried to ignore. Lisa knocked and entered, and the Concordat Council wants to meet with you, she said, and they're impressed, and they want to discuss expanding human participation in galactic governance, and apparently we've proven ourselves worthy of more responsibility. Daniel smiled and tell them, I'll consider it, he said, but right now, I just want to sleep for about a week, and then maybe take a vacation and somewhere quiet and peaceful and far from tribunals and Krathians and galactic politics. You've earned it, Lisa said, but you know you won't actually rest, and there's too much work to do and too many opportunities to explore, and you love this too much to walk away. She was right, and Daniel knew it, and humanity had a place in the galaxy now, and someone needed to make sure they made the most of it, and that they never forgot the lessons learned, and that they stayed ready for whatever challenges came next. Because the galaxy was vast and dangerous, and full of species, both friendly and hostile. And the Krathians would remember their humiliation. And other empires might test humanity's resolve. But now, humanity knew something crucial, and they knew that they could compete and that they could win, and that their strength came not from weapons but from determination and intelligence and the willingness to fight on every battlefield, including the legal one. Ambassador Daniel Price had saved his species by remembering a rule that everyone else forgot. And in doing so, he had proven that humanity belonged among the stars, and not as victims, and not as conquerors, but as equals, and as survivors, and as a species that would never stop fighting for their right to exist. The galaxy would never underestimate humanity again.